What's up, guys? Welcome back to the Light Lamp Podcast. I'm here with Steve,
Hello.
as always. And today we're going to be talking about a little bit of NHL news along with discussion of a couple of more teams that have clinched. So, might be a shorter episode today. We'll see what ends up happening. But we'll start with some NHL news. We'll start with the announcement of the 2023 NHL Winter Classic will be the Penguins against the Bruins at Fenway Park, Boston, in January 2nd. So, I think that it's pretty good. Fenway being one of the more notable baseball stadiums.
This is the second time Fenway's had it, right?
Yeah, who did the Bruins play that first? Was it the Leafs?
The Flyers.
Oh, the Flyers, right? Yeah. Um, you know, the two teams being what it is, you knew the NHL was basically itching for a reason to get the Penguins back on some big stage one way or the other, considering that they weren't involved in the
Stadium
games
Series.
that whatever lake, not Lake Tahoe.
Yeah, it was Lake Tahoe.
It was Lake Tahoe, right? Yeah. So like you knew that the NHL was like rubbing their hands together, like, ooh, Penguins are back in the playoffs. Here they come, right? So it's like,
Yeah, and I mean, we can complain all we want about the NHL not really doing a great job of like expanding the Winter Classic to include, let's say less marquee franchises. But I mean, it makes sense, right?
well, they're trying to make
Like,
money off of it, right?
yeah, like from a business perspective, nobody would give a shit about the Super Bowl if one of the teams playing it every year was a shit can. Like the NHL has proposed the Winter Classic to be like their Super Bowl in terms of like a spectacle and an event. I know we've talked about this in the past. Mostly just because like the playoffs don't allow for that, right? Like the Stanley Cup Finals don't allow for like a Super Bowl type atmosphere because it's a series. Like it's can go 7 games, so like it wouldn't make sense to have like this traveling circus of a Super Bowl to go all over the country. So when you look at it like from that perspective as like it being a spectacle, it's like of course they're gonna put Sidney Crosby in as many of these fucking things as they can. Like the guy's still a marquee athlete. He might not be the best player in the league anymore, but he's still a top 5 player in the league, and the guy's name puts asses in seats.
Yeah, I mean, for what it's worth, this may very well be the last time we see these two teams kind of at this level of competition for a couple of years because both these teams are in for somewhat painful rebuilds. The Penguins specifically are in for a very long rebuild when the Sidney Crosby, Evgeny Malkin era wraps up, and when we're starting to see, even though they had a good season this season, um, whether or not that's actually due to them playing well or maybe some other teams in the division kind of falling flat, you can debate that all you want. But they're having a good year this year. I think that they'll still be competitive for the next 2 to 3 years, but at some point, like that's gonna kind of wrap up, and the Bruins have already kind of shown like their stock has been steadily declining year after year. So I mean, I think it's good to get these two teams in while you still can. Not to say that these two teams are gonna be bad next year, right? But you don't want to constantly be giving these guys like, oh, let's just give them the Winter Classic every year until they're bad or something like that, right? So like this might be the
Yeah.
last time you see Penguins Bruins on a stage like this where they're both still really good, for the next couple of years. So, um, yeah, I mean Fenway, I think it's a good choice. Obviously, one of the most iconic stadiums, period, point blank, in all of major sports in North America. They held it here in 2010 when the Bruins beat the Flyers 2-1 in overtime. So this is the third classic for the Penguins, their sixth NHL outdoor game. You know, I guess you couldn't really, you could do much worse than this. Like I do like the NHL Winter Classic is always a big debate, right? In terms of like, is it a spectacle anymore when we have like 17 Stadium Series games? But I think that this is good. I think that this is definitely something I'll be tuning into, if nothing else. Again, just to see how they handle Fenway, because when they did it in 2010, the NHL Winter Classic was still kind of a newer concept. So it's going to be interesting to see 12 years later and 12 iterations of the Winter Classic later how they handle it. So, yeah, that's pretty much that. Unless you have any other comments about that
No, not really.
situation. Yeah, good matchup. Good stadium. Can't really complain too much. Definitely better than the last couple, I think, that we've seen. But on to some other news. A guy that has been involved in the NHL news quite a lot this year, actually, which is very, very unusual, I'll say. Jonathan Toews is back. He's back in the news column, and not in a good way. Again, Jonathan Toews up until this point, really up until last year, was kind of defined by his moniker of Captain Serious, right? Like he just never really said much, never really talked much, and I guess he's been sparing us this whole time because
Evidently.
yeah, because something has changed and he's decided to speak his mind, and oh boy, it is not great when he does. Between essentially trying to hijack the Kyle Beach situation to die on the hill of Chicago Blackhawks management, to going to bat for people he shouldn't, throwing his team under the bus, and then his latest thing he's decided is to go to a new route, which is just straight up complaining and whining in the media. And so he did an interview. They asked him about his thoughts about a potential rebuild, like kind of the direction that the Chicago Blackhawks look like they're going for. And I'm just going to give you a couple of quotes from the man himself. He said, "I just think it sometimes helps me to hear their honesty. I think it helps to have that line of communication, to know what they expect out of me, and I know what they need, and I know what my job as a player, as a captain in the locker room. I think part of the frustrating thing the past couple of games is they're moving the lines around, this and that. I mean, that's just an example." And then they later asked him, how do you feel about the trades? And he said, coming off the trade deadline, he said, "Oh, it's a little disheartening to see some key parts of our lineup and our group get traded away." And then they asked him, "How do you feel about the rebuild that looks like it's going to be on its way?" And he said, "I feel like I just need to take it one day at a time. Obviously, there's some learning for me to be just in the moment and not be so results oriented all the time. I mean, I don't know. I don't know what's going to happen this summer. I don't know what moving parts. I don't know what's going to happen. We'll just take it day by day and not overthink it and take one challenge at a time as they come." This does not sound like the kind of guy you want helming a rebuild, does it? I mean,
No.
like, I got to be honest here, you want a strong locker room leadership for a rebuild, right? You want some veterans who have been there, done that, and been with the organization for a long time. But when this guy is just complaining left, right, and center about everything, and, granted, look, I think that there's something to be said for respecting what he's done for the organization and maybe being honest and having communication with him about the rebuild. But bottom line is, there's been a ton of organizational changes for this franchise as of late. So they haven't really had time to build up that rapport with these new coaches and ownership, or not ownership, like coaches and GMs and stuff like that. And also, what do you mean you don't know what your job is as a captain? It's very obvious. Your job as a captain is to lead this team into the next generation and set an example. But when you're just like, I don't know what's going on, there's too many moving parts, I don't know what's going to happen, I wouldn't want that energy in my locker room during a rebuild. I mean, how do you feel about this whole situation?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely not the kind of guy I'd want being my message sender in the locker room if I'm the coaching staff or the managerial staff. It sounds like sour grapes, right? Like he was fortunate enough to win a lot of games early in his career, and it sounds like he doesn't know how to handle losing all that well, which is not something you want to run a rebuild, considering usually when you're rebuilding, you're losing a lot of games. And I think you can tell that based on how he said he's been results oriented, which to me lends me to believe he doesn't have the skill set, not necessarily as like a player, but the skill set as maybe as a person and a captain to necessarily like helm the rebuild, right? Because it takes a different kind of tool. It's a different kind of toolbox if you're a helming a rebuild than it does to push a team over the hump, right? To get a team to win in the playoffs, you might have to get in some people's faces. You might have to push some buttons. You might have to, do some things that you're not really looking to get out of somebody in a rebuild, right? Because like during a rebuild, there's no positive outcome from like getting in somebody's face or pushing buttons in like a certain kind of way, you know. So I don't think. I mean, if I'm Chicago, I'm looking to try to get out from under this problem as quickly as possible, right? Like try to either trade him or see what you can do to get rid of him. For honestly, at this point, both parties benefit because like he's not happy being in Chicago anymore. He can say all he wants. Oh, I love this organization. I love this city. But at the end of the day, like you're clearly not happy with the direction of the franchise. I mean, so why are they going to risk you poisoning the well for them just because you like it here, quote unquote,
Yeah, I mean, the problem is it comes off very entitled, right? And yes, is Jonathan Toews one of the best captains that Chicago has seen in their history? Arguably, I think certainly, right? Like a three-time Stanley Cup champion, been captain for quite a long time. Chicago has always been, outside of a few bad years as of late, they were always competitive. So he's earned that stock, right? You know, management in the NHL has come to realize that your big name players that are in that locker room, bringing them in on certain things is not a bad thing, and in fact, a lot of times it's a positive thing. Like I'm sure, while Henrik Lundqvist was still in New York, there was a lot of communication with him about, specifically when it came down to the end of his career with Shesterkin and Georgiev in a buyout and all that. I'm sure they didn't just hit him with that out of the blue. And in fact, when we've seen players be, traded out of the blue without any warning to them, without any discussion from them, finding out on social media, and that stuff is getting called out, which I think is a good thing, right? Because regardless of the kind of player, whether they're a first liner or a fourth line bender, it's a human thing, right? Just call them, hey, we wanted to tell you before you found out you've been traded, right? But like,
right.
Wasn't it Fleury? They didn't tell Fleury at all that he got traded until like the day after or something like that.
Yeah, it was something weird like that.
And it's like, okay, that's not gonna fly. So like, obviously, yeah, sure, Jonathan Toews feels like he's entitled to some discussion with management, and he is to a certain extent, but it also kind of feels like damned if you do, damned if you don't, because management can look at him and say, hey, we're rebuilding, and then he's just going to complain about the fact that they're rebuilding, right? So what is he looking for? Is he looking for management to lie to his face and say, no, we're starting to trade competitive because that's what he wants to hear? Or what? Because you can't be like, tell me, and then when they tell you, you go back in the locker room and like these 21 and 22-year-olds just see, Kirby Dach, for example, see Sean Toews come back in the locker room just bitching and moaning left, right, and center about management. Like, what kind of example is that setting? You know what I'm saying?
No, I agree. I think the other thing is, like, I don't know if Chicago really needs to bring him in to all of this, right? Because all the overtures they've made for the last so many years in the off seasons have pretty much led to the indication that they're rebuilding and, or at the very least, retooling. So I don't understand. I mean, I get what he's saying, right? Like, he never had a conversation with the general manager at the time. But, I mean, the Blackhawks haven't been, like, shady about what they've been doing. I mean, it's been very up on Front Street. It's been very open about what their intentions are and what kind of direction they want to take the team in. So it sounds to me, like you said, like an entitlement thing, like a player who feels like he should be part of the decision-making process here when maybe management doesn't feel that way because either they feel he's not part of the long-term picture, so why bring him in to one of these situations, right? Like, why bring him in on the conversations about the direction of the franchise when in their eyes he's not going to be here all that much longer, or B, management feels like they don't need to bring him in and have like the actual conversation based on the fact that like they've sent a very clear signal, in what they've done and what they've said in the press and the moves they've made over the last couple of years. I mean, last offseason was kind of a weird one when they bring in Marc-Andre Fleury and trade for Seth Jones. I mean, that could have sent some mixed signals, but by the midpoint of this year, when they were firmly out of playoff contention, I think it should have kind of crystallized into focus for him, like what was happening and like what direction the team was going to take.
And like you said, not for nothing. It's not like management gave up on this team for no reason. Coming into this year, it felt like management was doing everything they possibly could to make this team competitive. And they could have just folded the chance and just let everyone go and just came in with the same roster as last year. But you don't bring in Marc-Andre Fleury and trade for Seth Jones and then immediately sign him to a $9.5 million contract extension if you're not giving this roster a chance. So it's not like Jonathan Toews and the Chicago Blackhawks didn't have a chance to do something this year. But here we are in April, and the Chicago Blackhawks have a 24-38-11 record with 59 points, and they're firmly out of the playoffs. So what does he want? Management didn't just give them scraps and pieces and say, okay, well, look, we traded for a third liner. That should be enough, right? Oh, it wasn't? Oh, we're going to rebuild. No, they gave you a top 10 defenseman in the NHL in Seth Jones and somebody who had been playing like a top 10 goalie in the NHL and currently kind of still is in Minnesota. So, like, what do you want? You know what I'm saying? Like, I don't know. And it's going to be an interesting question because Patrick Kane and Jonathan Toews' contracts are up in 2 years. If you're Chicago, are you even going to sign Jonathan Toews? Even if he wants to come back, which it seems like he doesn't, are you even going to try to sign Jonathan Toews at this point?
I mean, if I'm Chicago, I'm not even trying to see the end of this contract out. You know what I mean? I'm trying to get rid of him as soon as I can. But if it comes to it and they're forced to eat the contract for 2 more years, I wouldn't sign him again, no.
Yeah, like next year's his last year on this deal, right? So next offseason, excuse me. I would just be like, listen, Jonathan, like, you wanted honesty and communication? Like, I'm not signing you. Like,
We're taking the team in a different direction and, like...
Bye.
Yeah.
And it sucks because this is a guy who, up until this point, had been nothing but respectful, one of the nicest players in the NHL. Like, sure, he always played with, like, a little bit of an edge on the physicality side of things, but he very, very, very rarely ever crossed that line. Never really said much. And this isn't me being like old head boomer hockey, they should shut up and play. I don't have an issue with Jonathan Toews voicing his opinions. My problem is that his opinions are just asinine. Every time he opens his mouth, he's saying something absurd. You know what I'm saying? Like, I think he has a right to be upset, but the way he's putting it out there, it just comes off as just whining. If he came in and he was like, listen, like, I'm not going to lie, I'm upset with the way the team played this year. I'm upset with our performance. We had a couple of good moves in the offseason, and we didn't do anything with it. And quite frankly, I got to be honest with you, I don't know if I'm going to be here for the long-term rebuild. I think that would just be being honest. But to come in and basically just start pointing fingers at everyone else in the room besides yourself, it just comes off as just whining and complaining. And
yeah, it's just not a good look to be had,
It's just silly. So, I don't know. I'm kind of sick and tired of hearing Jonathan Toews speak at this point. Like, I kind of just want him to shut up because whether he's going to bat for an organization that hid and aided and abetted sexual abuse, or just bitching and moaning about a rebuild that everyone else saw coming 2 years ago, I don't know. It's a very, like you said, not good look at all. So we will move on to talk about some of these teams in the playoffs. If unless you have anything else to say about Jonathan Toews
Not
and that
particularly,
situation.
no.
So since we've last talked, you faithful listener, whoever's listening, and only two more teams have officially clinched a spot in the NHL postseason. The New York Rangers and the Toronto Maple Leafs have both officially clinched a playoff berth. In fact, the Rangers are still well within grasp of winning the Metropolitan Division. They are 2 points back of the Hurricanes. The Hurricanes have a game in hand. It looks at this point like the Rangers would have to basically fall off a cliff to end up in a wild card spot because the Capitals are 10 points back. And the Caps do have 2 games in hand, sure, but to make up a 10-point difference in 9 games is not the easiest thing to do. So it looks like the Rangers are going to be fighting for a spot in the top 3 in the Metropolitan Division. Still could very well win the whole thing. And the Toronto Maple Leafs, similar situation. It looks like they're pretty well locked into a top 3 spot, although the Bruins are only 5 points back, both teams with 9 games left to go. So it's a possibility that the Leafs could end up falling out of the top 3. So that remains to be seen. But we'll start with the New York Rangers, since that was the first team that I mentioned. 48, 21, and 6, 102 points. First playoff berth in 4 years, 5 years,
Something like that.
So, I'll go to you first. Obviously, being a Rangers fan, on the grand scale of bona fide Stanley Cup contenders, dark horses, playoff teams, where do you think that this team lands on that scale?
I guess I'd have to put them as a dark horse, just because with how hot Shesterkin's been, it seems like the team's gonna go as far as he can carry them, So, just based on his play alone, I would put them in the dark horse category. I don't think they're good enough to be like a Stanley Cup contender right now, like a bona fide Stanley Cup contender. There's still a lot of maybe not holes, but a lot of roles on the team that players need to grow into a little bit more. But they have a shot to make some noise, right? Like, I don't think there's any team in the division that jumps out at me and says, like, this team is going to run roughshod over the Rangers, right? Like, Carolina's probably be the toughest matchups the Rangers pulled in the playoffs if they got them at all, and that's just because, like, the Carolina Hurricanes and the Rangers have, like, a weird record where, like, when Carolina was really bad, the Rangers beat up on them all the time, but ever since Carolina's been, like, halfway decent, the Rangers haven't been able to beat them, like, at all. So it'll be interesting. Right now it looks like the Rangers are going to match up against the Penguins in the first round, which would be interesting, to say the least. I know the Rangers swept the season series, but that doesn't really mean much once the playoffs start.
Yeah, I would have to agree. I think they fit to me in somewhere in the realm of dark horse Stanley Cup contender, or my definition of tier list would be either dark horse Stanley Cup contender or like just a playoff team. Somebody who comes into the playoffs and they're doing a lot of really, really good things, but there's a couple of spots that you can look at that are going to need to be overcompensated for by other spots in the roster. And I think that's the big thing that has me. The biggest reason why I'm not ready to say that the Rangers are a bona fide Stanley Cup contender just yet is because of just how much they've relied on Igor Shesterkin this year. Which, look, having a goalie who's playing as well as Igor Shesterkin is absolutely not a bad thing. The only person even in his stratosphere this year in terms of Vezina caliber play, in my opinion, has been Freddie Anderson. And Anderson has a sturdier defensive system in front of him. Like, Shesterkin has had to steal an untold number of games this year for the New York Rangers. every time this guy steps into the net, it doesn't matter who they're playing. The Rangers have a chance to win. And that's the best thing you can ask from your goaltender. So it's not a bad thing that they're relying on him as much as possible. But it does point to a couple of things that I think would need to be adjusted before I'm really willing to say that they're on the level of like a Florida Panthers or a Tampa Bay Lightning kind of team, right? Number one in my mind that sticks out, I don't know if you feel the same way, would be that second line center position. I made a joke in the chat the other night that if Ryan Strome could hit the net, it could hit an empty net, he'd be a 60 goal scorer.
I mean, the truth.
And I just think that that's a position that really needs to be looked at because they don't really have, a true matchup type center. Like I think Andrew Kopp does that job decently well, and I think that he can play shutdown against some levels of players, but I think that's one position they need to kind of look at this coming off season. But they're doing a lot of really good things really well. I mean, Chris Kreider, for the first time in his career, has managed to stay hot all season instead of scoring 35 goals really quickly and then doing nothing.
Yeah.
Adam Fox is as good as ever. Zibanejad looks like he's finally maybe not back to that 50-goal score that we thought he could be, but he should hit 30 this year. He's got 75 points in 5 games. Panarin is Artemi Panarin. There's just a couple of players, like you said, growth-wise. Like, I want to ask you specifically about Lafreniere and Capo Caco, who, Caco's missed some time this year with illness and injury. Lafreniere has played every game to this point, or almost every game to this point. Two guys that I think a couple of holes in the roster, like specifically on the second line, that they were kind of expected to fill this year. So what do you think about the two younger players on this roster of Lafreniere and Capo Caco?
I mean, they've just taken a while to find their game, and I don't know if there's anything. I don't know if there's anything necessarily wrong with that. They've just, I mean, it seems like the team banked too hard on the idea that these guys could fill these roles without having to prove they could do it, And I just think they need a little more time. If 3 years from now we're still having this conversation, then, then it's a problem. But the fact that, like, I think Lafreniere is only 19 and Capo Caco's 21 doesn't really, like, make me want to ring any alarm bells, like I haven't hit the panic button yet.
Yeah, I mean, I'm pretty much in the same boat as you. I think that while it would be nice, to have these guys become the second line wingers this season, it's a little bit unrealistic, I think, it's just one of those things where it seems like everything is going so well for this team that you almost kind of expect them to just, like, all of a sudden turn into these players. But
yeah, more or less.
It's just not the way it goes. It's just bottom line. I mean, that is something that the Rangers are going to have to be aware of in the playoffs when you look at their forward group. Panarin, Zibanejad, Kreider, and Strome are all having pretty good seasons with 89, 75, 71, and 48 points respectively. But the depth scoring kind of drops off after that, with the next highest scorer being Barclay Goodrow, who's got 28 points in 72 games. Laugh with 25 points in 72 games. So, maybe the scoring depth could be an issue in the playoffs. That's something that they certainly have to take into account. But, I mean, I want to ask you, because the issue with the Rangers the last couple of years has been defense. Now, goaltending can make defense look very, very good. So if we kind of just isolate the defense itself and not take into account just how unbelievable Igor Shesterkin has been this year, how do you think that the Rangers have done from a defensive perspective this season?
I think they've been a much better team than they've been in the past. I mean, they definitely are blocking more shots. There's been more of a team commitment to defending. I mean, there's still some bumps and some growing pains because the team is still fairly young. But, I mean, it's definitely leaps and bounds better than what it was under David Quinn.
Do you think that it's a system change that has been most effective, some player growth, or a little bit of both?
Probably a little bit of both. I mean, I think Igor Shesterkin gets a fair amount of the praise, obviously, for the way the Rangers have played this year, considering he's been such a big reason for it. But I don't think Gerard Gallant's getting nearly enough credit for taking, I mean, what is essentially an identical team to the one that David Quinn had last year, minus a few depth players, and turning it into a team that can compete for the top of the division, you know? So I think there's something to be said for both, like, yeah, it is some player growth, but I think the structure of the team is much better than it's been, you know?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely there's definitely been some changes that Gallant has put in that have changed the way that this team has operated. I mean, you know, when you look at the actual stats as far as team stats are concerned, uh, the Rangers are middle of the pack in terms of goals for. I mean, they're 16th in goals scored. In terms of goal against, they're actually third. So it's funny because we always kind of think that as the Rangers, like, oh, this like high flying offensive team, which they obviously have the talent to do that, but their goals against has been sneakily one of their strongest positions this year. Again, you can bring up the debate of whether or not that's just Igor Shesterkin playing out of his mind or whatever the case is. Um, some people would point to Georgiev and be like, well, this is what it looks like when the team gets more average goaltending. I don't think that's fair, in my opinion. I think that's kind of a straw man argument just because I think at this point it's pretty obvious that Georgiev is the kind of player who thrives on playing more, and so kind of taking a back seat to Shesterkin, which, I mean, how do you pull this guy out of the net at this point? I don't know. You know what I'm saying? Like, it's not like Dave, like Gerard Grant has anything out for Georgiev. It's just like he doesn't have a choice.
Trophy candidate, yeah. You have the Vezina Trophy winner playing every night, like.
You don't have a choice. It's like when Curtis McElhinney was on the Lightning. It's not like a knock against McElhinney. He's one of the best backups in the NHL, but like you have Andrei Vasilevsky. So like, what do you want from me?
More or less, yeah.
So I'm personally excited to watch the Rangers in the playoffs because I'm excited to see where this team goes, and I think it's going to be a very, very helpful thing for management to go into this offseason having played against some pretty good teams. Like if the playoffs started right now, I think the Rangers would beat the Penguins, and then I believe, I think that the Hurricanes would be able to get past the Bruins, and then the Rangers would play the Hurricanes in the second round. I think that the Hurricanes would win that, but I think regardless of that, just the fact that the Rangers are going to get to see how this roster performs in the playoffs is huge, and that can kind of highlight some things that maybe you don't see in the regular season or maybe aren't as obvious. Like, when the Rangers play, or if the Rangers play the Pittsburgh Penguins, and then you're like, okay, we have Malkin and Crosby. We're noticing a pattern of not really being able to kind of match up our centers. Let's address that in the offseason. You get to see some data that you might not. So, all that to say, do I think the Rangers could win the Stanley Cup? I mean, if Shesterkin keeps playing the way he is, I mean, Jesus, it's certainly a possibility.
Like I said, they'll go as far as he can carry them, more or less.
And I mean, he's just been so fucking good this year. It's really been like unbelievable. So, Rangers look like they're in a pretty good position right now to make some noise in the playoffs. Really, when I'm looking at the teams in the playoffs in the East, there's only 3 teams that I look at that I think I would feel confident in saying the Rangers would lose to. I think they have a chance against any of the other teams in the division. In fact, I think they have winning matchups against most of the other teams in the playoffs, quite honestly. I think that they would win the matchup against the Penguins. I think that they'd beat the Leafs. I think they'd beat the Bruins. I think they'd beat the Capitals. The only three teams that I think they would give them any trouble, or not give them any trouble, but I think the three teams that I would feel confident saying that they would probably lose to would be the Hurricanes, the Panthers, and the Lightning. And could they even win those? Yeah, absolutely. I mean, without a doubt, the Rangers could absolutely win those series. So definitely a scary team to go up against in the playoffs. Whoever draws them in the first round, good luck. That's all I can say. So speaking of other teams that have clinched, we're going to go over to the Toronto Maple Leafs. The other team that has clinched 47, 20, and 6, 100 points on the dot, clinching a playoff berth. Is this the year we finally see the Leafs win a playoff series? Steve, yes or no?
No. Shocking all of you fans, I know. That me saying the Toronto Maple Leafs are not built for a playoff run should come as absolutely no surprise to anybody, right? Like, this team hasn't addressed any of the issues that it's had for the last 3 years, 4 years now. I mean, their goaltending has been absolutely abysmal for stretches of this year. I mean, they waived Peter Mrazek. Their defense, outside of like Jake Muzzin, hasn't been all that helpful, and the addition of Mark Giordano also hasn't seemed to have been all that helpful. The real thing that Toronto Maple Leafs have going for them this year is the fact they can just score like fucking crazy. I mean, Austin Matthews might score 70 goals this year. Like, so if you're gonna ask me, like, are the Maple Leafs a Stanley Cup contender, I would tell you no. Just because, like, I don't think they could beat. Honestly, I don't think they beat a lot of the teams that are in the Eastern Conference. I don't think they could beat Washington. I don't think they could beat Carolina. I don't think they could beat Pittsburgh. I mean, they might be able to get by the Bruins, maybe. I don't think they get by the Panthers or the Lightning, which is kind of a tough draw because it looks like they're going to draw one of the two in the first round. Yeah, I mean, it's the same old song and dance in Toronto. So, like, why would it change, right?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that was actually a strength of this team for large stretches of the year was the goaltending. And then when you look at the last 10 games that Jack Campbell has played, who, by the way, at one point, people were saying was a Vezina candidate, which I agree with. At one point, he certainly was. In his last 10 games, he's allowed 2 goals or fewer only twice, which means 8 of those games he's allowed more than 3. And in fact, in a lot of these games, he's allowing more than 3, which is, for NHL standards is not good, right? His last 10 games, 1 goal against, 5, 4, 5, 5, 4, 3, 2, 4, 3. It's not good enough, bottom line. And in these games, he's had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 7 games out of his last 10 with a save percentage below 900. And I'm a goalie apologist. You guys know that. I always say you have to watch the games to see the goals that are going in. You can't just look at stats and be like, oh, this guy sucks. But you watch the games, and it doesn't get any better for him. He's letting in really weak goals. The defense looks like complete garbage. As much as yeah, go ahead.
I was gonna say it's all around, like, Toronto's defensive structure is just not there,
And as much as as many teams that are currently in the playoffs have glaring weaknesses, you can make the argument, you can point to almost any team in the playoffs and say that there's a glaring weakness, right? Like, even you point to a team like the Carolina Hurricanes, right? And you can say, well, their second line wingers really aren't that great, all things considered. And the defense has taken a step back maybe from like top 10 in the NHL to just really good. You can look at the Rangers and be like, the second line wingers are clearly an issue. The second line centers are clearly an issue spot. You can take a look at the Tampa Bay Lightning and say that they've been inconsistent. Even though they have 96 points and 44 wins, they don't look like the same team. But as many teams in the playoffs that have glaring weaknesses, I think that there is no other team in the playoffs that have as glaring of a weakness outside of maybe the Edmonton Oilers, as glaringly obvious a weakness as the Toronto Maple Leafs are. And come playoff time, you bet your ass that these guys are scouting those weaknesses, and that's where it's going to get exploited. That's why being a complete team from top to bottom is so important in the playoffs, because a regular season game where the Rangers are playing the Toronto Maple Leafs, yes, Gerard Gallant has done his homework. He knows who he's going up against, but he plays them once and then he doesn't play them again for another 4 months. 7-game series, you're studying this team. A lot of these coaches have already started. If they've locked up a playoff spot, they've already started scouting every other team that has a playoff spot right now. You're going to know these intricacies and these little details. So if teams find a way to exploit small weaknesses in teams, how do you even make up for such an obvious flaw in your roster at this point? Like, you just don't.
I mean, yeah, that's really the answer, right? I don't think you can.
And, you're not getting an easy draw regardless of what happens. You're playing in a really, really good division. I guess my question is what's the saving grace here for the Toronto Maple Leafs? Like, what would they have to do in order to be successful in this playoff series, or in this current upcoming playoff run? Is it just score? I mean, is that just the answer?
Yeah, they really just have to score their way to a Stanley Cup. That's the only way I can see them doing it, right? Because they can't defend their way to it. They're not gonna stymie teams offensively. They're really gonna have to just push the pace and hope that they can just outskate most teams. You know what I mean? And try to tire them out that way. Because they're not gonna be able to tire teams out physically. They're not gonna be able to go in there and hit a team for 4 or 5 games so that they wear them down. Toronto's best bet is they're just gonna have to skate and keep skating and really just try to wear a team out that way and try to score as many goals as they can.
Which would be we've seen that strategy be employed before when younger teams play older teams in the playoffs. Just use your legs and use your youth. But the Panthers, the Lightning, they're really not old. You know what I'm saying? A lot of these players on this team are really young, specifically in the Florida Panthers. If they end up drawing into Boston Bruins, sure, there's a lot of veterans on that team that you might be able to exploit, but I don't know. It's just, where on the tier list of teams are you placing them? Because honestly, I would place them just as just a straight up playoff team. They're good in the regular season. They did the right things in the regular season, but there's some very, very obvious holes here that need to be addressed, right?
That's more or less where I was going to put them. I was even going to say playoff disappointment, a team that's perennially gets in but can't get out of the first round. They're at some point they got to make a change, right? Because how many times are you going to make the playoffs just for the sake of saying you made the playoffs? The whole point of making it to the dance is so you can have a shot at the trophy, right? Why show up to the dance and then immediately kneecap yourself every year? It doesn't make any sense. And it's just so ridiculous to see. We watch teams. I mean, for what it's worth, I would honestly classify the Toronto Maple Leafs as a more extreme version of the experiment that's going on in Colorado right now. They're Toronto's what the logical conclusion of what Colorado could become. Essentially, it's the same theory. So by the same token, right, Toronto's just as big of a glass cannon as Colorado. The only reason I would put Colorado in as a dark horse Stanley Cup or as a Stanley Cup contender is because that conference is so weak. Whereas Toronto's conference is strong, their division's strong, and even if they cross over into the Metropolitan, it's strong. So Toronto doesn't have the opportunity to get a couple easy rounds in, right? Colorado could catch a team like Edmonton coming out of the wild card and just absolutely body them in the first round. Because Edmonton can't defend either, so they're just another glass cannon. And we saw what happened when a team took it to them and tried to skate with, forced them to skate with them. Chicago blew them off the ice. So a team like Colorado, which is significantly better than Chicago, could take a team like Edmonton on, right? But in the Eastern Conference, Toronto doesn't have an Edmonton Oilers to beat up on. Like the weakest teams in this conference are still teams like the Washington Capitals and the Pittsburgh Penguins. And those just aren't exactly like walks in the park. I mean, I don't like either of those matchups for the Toronto Maple Leafs. So they're just a team to me that's just here to be here every year. Like they never seem to take themselves seriously enough, I guess, to make the actual changes, or they clearly live in some sort of like weird cognitive disconnect of reality where they're making progress somehow, even though it's been the same roadblock, the same for the last 4 years since Austin Matthews has got there, and it's called the first round. Usually it's called the Boston Bruins, but this year it might be the Tampa Bay Lightning or any number of teams from that division because they're all jockeying for position still. So it's just, I don't know. I don't feel good about the Toronto Maple Leafs.
Yeah, I mean, here's the thing, right? So when you look at a team like the New York Rangers, right, who you can say, yes, they've been very, very reliant on Igor Shesterkin to do a lot of things to get them to where they are at today. The difference between relying on Igor Shesterkin as much as the Rangers have versus relying on Austin Matthews and Mitch Marner for as much as the Maple Leafs had is that Igor Shesterkin plays 60 minutes. Austin Matthews only plays 20, 25 minutes a night. And don't get me wrong, he can absolutely take a game over and make a difference in those 25 minutes. But that's still 35 minutes of the game where he's not on the ice. And you're relying on your third and your fourth lines who, quite frankly, aren't very good. And they don't bring the physical part to the table. So, good luck matching up against the Bruins in the physical department. Good luck matching up against the Tampa Bay Lightning, who aren't as physical as they were when they were winning the past two Stanley Cups. But they still have guys like Alex Killorn, and now they have Corey Perry. So
Still have Pat Maroon.
right, so it's like they're not shrinking violets either. So there's just a lot of. It almost kind of feels like half the roster is just here to be here, like just there to fill up jerseys and take up space on the ice because it's not like they're doing anything. And I mean, no offense to the guys that are on this team on the third and fourth lines. I'm not trying to dunk on you for being like bad hockey players. You're obviously talented hockey players, but the problem is you're doing the same things that the first two lines are doing. So you're not bringing anything new to the table, and you're obviously not doing it as well as the first two lines. The New York Rangers made an obvious effort this past offseason to build a third line of players that are actually going to be different from the top two lines in the sense that they're going to be physically imposing. You don't go out and get Barclay Goodrow and Ryan Reeves for no reason. You don't go out and then trade for guys like Andrew Kopp and Tyler Mott, who might not be, the most physically imposing, but they're sandpaper type guys who are going to get involved in the stuff in the corners and stuff like that. They diversified the roster in a concentrated effort because they realized for the last 2 years we've been getting our ass kicked physically and we're losing games as a result. Now the Toronto Maple Leafs have been able to build the perfect regular season team, but the third and fourth lines aren't doing anything different than the first two lines, and they're not even doing it that well. So that's a problem. And then obviously the defense is a problem, and the goaltending, which you can't even argue like, oh, the goaltending fell apart when it was too late to do something, because the goaltending had dissipated essentially. Like they were like Omega sanctioned 3 weeks before the trade deadline. So it's not like this snuck up on them in the last 2 weeks like, oh crap, our goaltending fell apart. It's like, no, these guys had been Thanos snapped like a month before the trade deadline, so you had an opportunity to do something. There's just yeah, go ahead.
I was gonna say, like, in terms of like the roster construction, I think you're right. Like the third and fourth line are guys just there to be there because Toronto can't afford to pay anybody else. Like Toronto can't afford to actually go out and get guys to fill these spots that would more or less be upgrades on the guys they have. And I think that's really just like the problem when you tie $40 million up in 4 players. I mean, granted, two of them are two of the best players in the world, and one of them is your captain, so I get it. But, you know, it's not a winning playoff formula. It's not 2010 anymore, where you can have a team, just be pulled by two superstars as hard as they can and win a Stanley Cup. You really need like a full roster, a full, 24 man or whatever it is effort to make sure that this, works. And essentially Toronto playing mostly AHL players and their bottom six is not, you know, it's not good enough if they really want to compete. Because like you said, a team like Boston or a team like Florida or a team like Tampa, who even isn't even as deep as they've been, will still eat them alive in the depth department. So it's just like, why bother? You know?
It's just very odd that this lesson hasn't been learned yet. You know, there's nothing wrong with saying my roster construction has been flawed and I need to address that. You know, the Rangers, granted, the Rangers had a GM change who had a pair of fresh eyes, but, they looked at the team and said, all right, this thing we've been trying for the last 3 years, it's not working. We're scoring a lot, but we can't defend, and we're getting physically imposed on, which is causing issues for our goal scorers. Let's address that. They address that in a meaningful and impactful way, and look at the results. They're a really good team now. Granted, we haven't seen them in the playoffs just yet, but all indications are that at least they're addressing it. And, it's not even like you have to spend a ton of money to kind of get the things that you want out of some players. You can throw the money that you're spending on a guy like, oh, I don't know, Jason Spezza, or a guy like Ilya Mikheyev or Alexander Kerfoot. You can take that $3.5 million. You can take that $750,000. You can take that $1.6 million, and you can go out and pay somebody like, obviously not him specifically, but a guy like Matt Martin, who only is going to be making $1.5 million next year. You know what I'm saying? Like, you can get the things that you want in an affordable way. The Rangers did it. Like, granted, they had to pay, what's his face? Like, Barclay Goodrow is going to be making $3.6 million, but so is Alexander Kerfoot. He's making the same amount of money.
I'd argue that Barclay Goodrow is a more impactful player all over the ice than Alexander Kerfoot is.
Yeah, I would definitely agree. And I mean, Ryan Reeves is making $1.75 million. Sure, that's not the $750K you're spending on Jason Spezza, but what is Jason Spezza doing on your third line that your top two lines aren't doing? I don't get it. It's like, if the Toronto Maple Leafs are a glass of water and somebody desperately was asking for like some kind of flavor, and they were like, please just give me like a drop of lemon flavor to this roster, which in this weird analogy that I've just come up with, that's a garbage analogy, like the drop of lemon would be like any sort of grit or defense.
Mm-hmm.
The Rangers came over and dunked the whole lemon into water and said, oh wow, this drink is actually really good and balanced now. Whereas like the waiter for the Toronto Maple Leafs was like, oh, you have a glass of water and you need some flavor, and then he just dumped a pitcher of water on top of the water. It's like,
pretty much.
You know what I'm saying?
Bringing
like,
more of the same thing, yeah.
So, I don't know. I'm not feeling good about the Leafs. I don't think they have many good matchups. I don't really foresee them being able to beat many teams, if any. I mean, I think that they would have a shot at the Penguins. I think they have a shot at the Capitals. I think they would have an outside shot at the Bruins. I mean, just looking at the teams that they might potentially play, I don't think there's really any chance that they would play the Rangers or the Hurricanes in the first round at this point. and probably most likely there's almost no way they'd play the Panthers. So like of the Lightning, Bruins, and Capitals and Penguins, the teams that they might actually end up playing, they have a okay shot at two of them, but I wouldn't even call that a winning matchup for them. So another long off season ahead for them, I think. But
I hope they have their golf shorts ready.
advanced analytics, right?
Fancy stats.
Is there anything else you want to talk about before we wrap up here?
I don't think so.
So that's going to do it for this podcast, guys. Next time, we're going to do same thing. We're just going to see who clinches. I'm going to be talking about teams' playoff chances and, what goes on in the NHL. Who knows? Maybe Jonathan Toews will declare his love for, I don't know, checking from behind and say it shouldn't be a penalty anymore or something stupid and asinine like that. But anyway.
Maybe he'll come out and defend Harvey Weinstein or something. Who knows?
Yeah. He'll find something stupid to say. But, so next week, again, talking about some more playoff teams as things start to take shape in the NHL. So I want to thank you guys for watching, and I will see you guys again. Or we will see you guys again next time.